It was the morning of June 30th, 1940. The time was exactly 11 o'clock. A single Spitfire fighter plane thundered across the English Channel at 30,000 feet. But this was no ordinary Spitfire. It was painted a strange colour, a soft, pale pink. Its target was a German naval base in Brittany, France. The base had been captured by the German army only 11 days earlier. The pilot's name was George Patterson Christie, a young officer from the Royal Air Force's Photographic Development Unit. His mission was simple but dangerous. Fly over the enemy base, take photographs and return to England. Every rule of combat said he should have been dead within minutes. He was flying alone, unarmed, in broad daylight, over Nazi-occupied France and painted in pink, a colour that made no sense for war. Military experts would have called it suicide. Pink aircraft should have stood out like a flare in the sky. Pink was visible. Pink was vulnerable. Pink was wrong, except it wasn't. George Christie completed his entire flight. He photographed the base, every hangar, every dock, and returned to England safely. Not one German fighter saw him. He didn't survive because of luck. He survived because he was invisible. That strange pink paint officially called cametint pink, later refined into PRU Pink, which stood for Photo Reconnaissance Unit Pink, had turned his Spitfire into a ghost. At sunrise and sunset, the light in the sky changes colour. It becomes soft, hazy, and slightly red. That thin layer of pink atmosphere hides things that match its colour. So instead of standing out, the pale pink aircraft melted into the sky itself. What looked foolish on the ground became perfect in the air. The Germans were searching for dark green or grey planes against a bright blue sky. They never thought to look for something pink. This wasn't random luck or an artist's idea. It was science optical physics turned into camouflage. The man behind it was an eccentric Australian inventor and pilot named Sidney Cotton. He was daring, creative, and often disobedient, but he had a gift for seeing problems differently. He believed that clever design could save more lives than guns or armour ever could. Sidney Cotton tested his theories through constant trial and error and through the sacrifice of the men who flew these dangerous missions, known among pilots as dicing missions. That nickname came from the saying, dicing with death, because each flight over occupied Europe was exactly that, a gamble with their lives. And yet, the strange idea worked. It would go on to challenge everything the world's air forces believed about camouflage. When war began on September 3rd, 1939, the Royal Air Force had almost no proper photo reconnaissance ability. The standard method used old Bristol Blenheim bombers, slow, heavy aircraft fitted with cameras and defensive guns. They were easy targets for German fighters. In the first 4 months of the war, the RAF managed to photograph about 2,500 square miles of German-occupied Europe. But the price was terrible. 40 aircraft lost, most of them Blenheims. That meant one aircraft destroyed for every 60 or so square miles photographed. At that rate, mapping all of Hitler's fortress Europe would cost thousands of planes and countless lives. Then came Sidney Cotton, the Australian pilot and engineer who refused to accept that risk. Before the war officially began, Cotton had already been flying secret photographic missions over Germany using a civilian airplane, a Lockheed 12 Electra. He had proven something radical. Speed and altitude could replace armour and guns. A fast aircraft, flying very high and painted the right colour, could slip in and out of enemy airspace unseen. If you could avoid being spotted, you didn't need to fight. You just needed to take your pictures and get home. On October 16, 1939, Cotton convinced Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, to give him 2 precious Spitfires for modification. These Spitfires would not carry guns. They would carry cameras. Sidney Cotton's modified Spitfires were stripped of everything that did not make them faster or fly farther. All 8.303 Browning machine guns were removed. The ammunition boxes were taken out, the armour plating was thrown away, and even the radio was pulled from the cockpit to save weight. The gun ports were filled smooth with plaster of Paris and sanded until the surface was perfectly flat. Extra fuel tanks were added behind the pilot and under the wings, giving the aircraft the range it needed to cross deep into enemy territory and come back alive. In place of the guns, Cotton installed f/24 cameras with 8-inch lenses in the inner wings. These cameras could take sharp, high-resolution photos even from 30,000 feet. The result was a new kind of Spitfire, one built not for combat, but for seeing. A plane that could reach almost 390 miles per hour at altitude faster than the German Messerschmitt Bf 109E, which could only manage about 354 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Speed gave them an edge, but Cotton knew speed alone was not enough. The aircraft also had to disappear. The first Photo Reconnaissance Spitfires were painted in what Cotton called cametint green, a pale green color meant for high-altitude flights. On November 18, 1939, Flight Lieutenant Maurice Shorty Longbottom took Spitfire number NE3071 on the first ever RAF reconnaissance mission. He took off from Lille-Seclin airfield in France and flew all the way to Aachen, Germany, reaching 33,000 feet. The mission succeeded, and the photos were perfect, but it revealed a serious problem. Different altitudes and lighting conditions demanded different camouflage. At high altitudes above 25,000 feet, aircraft appeared as dark shapes against the bright sky when seen from below, or as black dots against the white clouds when seen from above. But at medium and lower altitudes between 5 and 15,000 feet, the air itself became a haze. And during dawn or dusk, when the sun hung low on the horizon, the entire sky turned soft and glowing with a faint pink light. This was where physics became strange. The human eye does not see objects directly. It only sees the light that bounces off them. An aircraft's visibility depends not on its real color, but on the contrast it creates with its background. Dark greens and blue-gray camouflage worked well against the clear midday sky, but they failed in softer light. At sunrise and sunset, or under low clouds lit by the sun, those sensible military colors stood out sharply as dark shapes against a pale background. Pink, however, was different. Pale pink matched the very light scattered by the atmosphere during those hours. It blended with the color of the haze itself. Instead of standing out, it merged into the horizon, almost dissolving in the air. This was not a guess or a lucky accident. The paint was scientifically mixed to match the exact tone of sunlight filtered through the morning and evening sky. The Royal Air Force Archives described the formula clearly. 1 part red using standard RAF roundel red to 10 parts pure white. The result was so light, it looked almost white until compared to a white card. It was never the bright pink used by the Royal Navy on ships known as Mountbatten Pink that was much darker. This new shade, called PRU Pink, short for Photo Reconnaissance Unit Pink, was extremely pale. It was created for Spitfires that flew at medium altitude, usually between 5 and 15,000 feet under or between clouds in the early morning or late afternoon. During those hours, the Germans struggled to track aircraft visually. The pink Spitfires used that weakness perfectly. Against the hazy glow of the sky, they were not targets, they were ghosts. By the end of 1940, the Royal Air Force's photographic unit had grown beyond its experimental stage. It was now an official Squadron No. 1 Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, known simply as No. 1 PRU. On November 14, 1940, a small detachment was set up at Saint-Ival in Cornwall. Their main goal was to photograph German naval bases at the French port of Brest. These missions soon gained a grim nickname, dicing missions. The term came from the phrase, dicing with death, because every flight meant flying low and slow over heavily defended targets while keeping a perfectly straight path for the cameras to work. One mistake, one sudden movement, and the mission would fail or the pilot would die. Flight Lieutenant Keith Arnold, the officer in charge, watched the cost mount day by day. Pilots were sent out and never came back. In one particularly tragic week, Arnold requested 2 replacement pilots from RAF Benson. They arrived, took off for Brest that same evening and vanished. 5 men were lost in quick succession, all trying to photograph the same targets. The German battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and the fortified docks where the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was building up its strength. Still, the missions continued. Those photographs were too important to give up. The pink Spitfires were a desperate, calculated gamble. They traded invisibility at high altitude, where they looked slightly too bright compared to the darker PRU blue aircraft for better protection at medium and low levels. They were built for those dangerous hours of sunrise and sunset when the sky glowed soft and hazy. During that golden hour, as pilots called it, the sun hung low and the sky took on its characteristic pink and grey shimmer. That was when the pink Spitfires disappeared into the haze. They didn't contrast against the air. They became part of it. One mission report captures this perfectly. A pilot flying through broken clouds at 300 feet suddenly found himself face to face with 2 German fighters Messerschmitt Bf-109s. They passed so close only about 50 yards away that he could clearly see the crosses on their wings. That distance is roughly the length of a cricket pitch. Yet the Germans flew right past him without realizing what they had seen. The pink Spitfire was there, but to their eyes it wasn't. The color worked for more than one reason. Yes, it matched the soft light of dawn and dusk. But pale shades white, light pink, or very pale blue also have another optical effect. They make objects look smaller and farther away in hazy air. Scientists understood this. Pale colors scatter light the same way that mist and moisture in the air do. That scattering makes edges blur into the background, and when the edges disappear, so does the sense of shape and distance. It's why a pink Spitfire could pass within yards of an enemy fighter and seem like nothing more than another patch of cloud. This same idea changed how other forces painted their planes. Our 8th Coastal Command and even the United States Navy began painting the undersides of their aircraft white to make them harder to spot while hunting submarines over the ocean. The lighter color reduced the distance at which they could be seen from below. It was the same science used the light of the sky, not the color of the ground, to disappear. Before the war, most camouflage theory was based on simple logic. Bombers were painted to match the ground when seen from above. Fighters were painted to match the sky when seen from below. But reconnaissance aircraft were different. They could fly at any altitude, at any angle, in every kind of light. No single color could hide them everywhere. So the Royal Air Force began using specialized camouflage schemes, each designed for a specific mission profile. For the high-altitude flights above 30,000 feet, they used PRU blue, a dark bluish tone that blended with the deep color of the upper sky. For low and medium altitudes below 15,000 feet, they used PRU Pink, the pale, almost white shade that vanished in haze and cloud. In North Africa and in the Far East, where the atmosphere was hotter and drier, and the light was golden rather than pink, reconnaissance Spitfires used a third color, a rich royal blue that matched desert haze perfectly. Each color had a purpose. Each was tested in the field by pilots who risked their lives, proving that sometimes science and courage could make a man invisible. The pilots themselves often disliked the pink paint. It went against everything they had been taught about survival. One recalled thinking his aircraft looked like a sore thumb while taxiing across the airfield. It seemed ridiculous, too bright, too cheerful, almost childlike. On the ground, a pink Spitfire looked anything but military, but the results spoke for themselves. While the Royal Air Force never kept separate records for pink versus blue reconnaissance Spitfires, the unit as a whole, the Photo Reconnaissance Unit, or PRU, had some of the highest loss rates in the entire Air Force and yet produced some of the most important intelligence of the war. Between November 1939 and the spring of 1940, Sidney Cotton's small group of modified Spitfires, usually no more than a handful ready to fly at once, photographed over 5,000 square miles of enemy territory. Not one was lost. That perfect record, of course, did not last. On April 10, 1941, Pilot Officer William Kenneth Manifold took off from St. Eval at 5:30 in the evening. His aircraft, Spitfire number P9396, was heading for another mission over Brest. 2 hours later, he was intercepted by a German pilot, Lieutenant Horenberg of Fighter Group 2/JG26. Manifold's Spitfire was shot down over the English Channel north of the town of Piscat. Neither he nor the wreckage was ever found. It was Horenberg's second reconnaissance Spitfire kill that day. But for every pilot who was lost, dozens completed missions that would have been impossible in standard camouflage. The key was not only the color, but how it was used. Pink Spitfires were never meant to fly in clear skies at noon. That was suicide. They were designed for the golden hours, dawn and dusk, or for days when the clouds hung low and broken. That was when the atmosphere itself changed color, turning the pale pink surface into a near-perfect shield. The success of the pink Spitfire came from understanding an entire system, how light, altitude, and timing worked together. There were 3 critical parts to that system. First, the color itself. It had to match the light of the atmosphere, not the color of the ground or the open sky. Cotton and his team realized that cameras and the human eye both see through the filter of haze and moisture. During low sun angles, that haze scatters light in soft red and violet tones. The 1:10 mix of red to white paint was not random. It matched the measured color of light reflected off thin clouds during sunrise and sunset. Second, the altitude. Too high, and the pink Spitfire looked too pale against the darker upper sky. Too low, and there wasn't enough haze to hide it. The perfect height was between 5,000 and 15,000 feet, high enough to stay safe from the most accurate anti-aircraft fire, but low enough to keep within the protective layer of colored haze. Third, the time of day. The missions were launched when the sun was about 10 to 15 degrees above the horizon, the exact window when the air glowed pinkest, and when the German defenses had the most trouble tracking aircraft visually. Return flights were planned for the same conditions in the evening. Clouds were welcome, not thick overcast, which blocked the view, but broken layers between 3 and 10,000 feet that reflected ultraviolet light and deepened the haze. Even the Spitfire's own design helped. Its Merlin engine, with a 2-stage supercharger, allowed quick changes in altitude. A pilot could climb to 30,000 feet to cross the English Channel unseen, dive to medium height over the target for photography, and then climb again for safety on the way home. The aircraft's polished metal skin also made a difference. It reduced drag and prevented tiny ice crystals from forming, which could glint in sunlight and give away the plane's position. And of course, the Spitfire was fast. Even unarmed, it could outrun most German interceptors. The Luftwaffe's ground controllers often had too little time to organize a pursuit. German doctrine was different. Their reconnaissance aircraft were usually converted bombers, such as the Junkers Ju-86P or the Ju-88. These planes relied only on altitude for protection. They flew at 40,000 feet and higher, where the air was thin and interception was difficult. They were large, heavy, and easy to spot once they descended. Eventually, British engineers developed new high-altitude Spitfires that could reach those same heights and shoot the German aircraft down. But Sidney Cotton's approach had been far more elegant. Rather than simply flying higher, he used the science of light and color to make the aircraft vanish within the very air it flew through. It was camouflaged not by pattern, but by physics. And that strange, pale pink the color everyone laughed at became one of the most successful camouflage experiments in aviation history. The German high-altitude bombers were clever, but they weren't invincible. They were large, heavy, and slow compared to a fighter, and from the right angle, their wide wings left long, sharp shadows that gave them away. To stop them, the British designed special high-altitude Spitfires, such as the Spitfire HF-7, fitted with extended wingtips and pressurized cockpits to reach extreme heights. On August 28, 1942, a single Junkers Ju-86R reached 42,000 feet and dropped bombs on the city of Bristol, killing 48 people. It was one of the highest bombing raids of the war, but the RAF responded quickly. Within months, the new high-altitude Spitfires began intercepting and shooting down the Ju-86s at those same heights, ending Germany's brief attempt at a high-altitude bombing campaign. The British photo reconnaissance approach was more refined, more scientific. Instead of relying on height alone, they used layers of strategy, different altitudes, different camouflage, and perfect timing to become almost impossible to see. At the top of the sky, where the air turned dark blue, they used PRU blue. At low and medium levels, where haze and clouds ruled, they used PRU Pink. Each aircraft was tuned for its specific mission. Some were built for long range, like the PR Mark IV Bowser, which carried 114 gallons of internal fuel. Others were built for low-level photography, such as the PR Mark V, which had cameras mounted sideways in the fuselage. And others still were designed for the medium altitudes where that pale pink camouflage worked best. Building an effective reconnaissance Spitfire meant taking away as much as you added. Every unnecessary pound of weight was removed and every ounce saved became distance gained. A normal Spitfire Mark I fighter carried 8 Browning machine guns, weighing about 140 pounds. It also carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition, another 190 pounds. Armor plating behind the pilot added 73 pounds more, and the full radio set another 50. All of it was stripped out. The total weight reduction was roughly 450 pounds, and that changed everything. The lighter Spitfire could fly about 18 miles per hour faster, and more importantly, 50% farther. The PR Type B, introduced in February 1940, carried an extra 29-gallon fuel tank behind the pilot. With an economical cruise speed of about 210 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, its range stretched to more than 700 miles. Then came the PR Mark IV, entering service in October 1940. It had fuel tanks built right into the leading edges of the wings, bringing total capacity to 229 gallons. That gave it endurance for 7 hours of flight, enough to cover nearly 2,000 miles. On one of its first missions, a Spitfire from this type flew all the way to the Baltic coast city of Stettin, now Szczecin. Poland, photographed the target and returned safely to England. A round trip of about 1,400 miles. The cameras themselves were engineering marvels. The F-24 camera, with an 8-inch lens, could capture details as small as 3 feet across from 30,000 feet up. The F-52 camera, with a 36-inch telephoto lens almost the size of a telescope, could pick out objects less than 2 feet wide from the same height. But these cameras brought their own problems. At high altitude, the temperature difference between the warm plane and the freezing air outside caused condensation to form on the lenses, and even the smallest vibration in flight could blur the photographs. Sidney Cotton solved both. He redirected warm air from the engine's cooling system through small ducts that blew gently across the camera lenses. That warm airflow stopped the fogging, completely an idea he had first tested before the war during his secret civilian flights over Germany in a Lockheed 12E Electra. To reduce vibration, the cameras were mounted on thick rubber shock absorbers. The pilot had to keep the plane perfectly level during each photo run. Even a small bump of turbulence or a few degrees off course could mean missing the target entirely. The job of a reconnaissance pilot was one of the hardest in the entire war. He flew alone, without guns, without a radio, and often without a wingman. Early PRU Spitfires had no radio at all. It was removed to save weight. For up to 7 hours, the pilot sat in a cramped, unheated cockpit, wrapped in layers of clothing against the cold. He had to navigate by dead reckoning, calculating his position, only by time, direction, and speed. He kept his eyes on his altimeter, his compass, and the rear-view mirror that showed the sky behind him. He had to watch constantly for German fighters, for anti-aircraft bursts, and even for his own contrails, the white trails of vapor that could betray his position to the enemy below. He had to time the photographs precisely, operate the cameras, and still manage his fuel to make it home. A single error could mean vanishing over the sea or crashing into enemy territory. It was a mission that demanded both precision and nerves of steel. For the pilots of the Photo Reconnaissance Unit, even the smallest mistake could mean death. Navigation errors were often fatal. Several pilots simply vanished over the North Sea or the English Channel, lost after missing their return bearings, their fuel running out somewhere over the dark water. The pink paint that made them invisible in the sky required careful maintenance. It wasn't brushed on like ordinary paint. Each aircraft was coated in several very thin layers over polished aluminum, then gently buffed to a semi-gloss finish. That finish reduced drag while keeping the right optical balance. If the surface was too shiny, sunlight would flash off the wings like a mirror. If it was too dull, the Spitfire would appear darker than the sky and lose its camouflage. Ground crews learned to repair and touch up the paint without ruining the smooth finish or changing the color. They used fine cloths and mild abrasives to polish every inch by hand. Even the shade itself changed slightly over time. The first batches, mixed using Sidney Cotton's own formula, were so light that they looked almost white with only the faintest hint of pink. Later, when the paint became standardized and mass-produced, the tone deepened slightly. Still, it was never the bright Barbie pink seen on model kits or restored aircraft today. Careful analysis of wartime photographs, when corrected for the old film types used in the 1940s, confirms the truth. The real PRU Pink was extremely pale, lighter than bare metal, but clearly not pure white. The photographs captured by those pink Spitfires helped shape the course of the war. In May 1940, one reconnaissance flight discovered something extraordinary. A Spitfire from the PRU photographed about 400 German tanks hidden under camouflage nets and trees in the Ardennes forest. Those images revealed the true focus of Germany's armoured build-up, the point where the Wehrmacht would soon punch through the French lines, bypass the Maginot fortifications, and split the Allied armies in two. Those photographs warned commanders that the Germans' plan to attack through ground, once thought impossible for tanks. On February 22, 1941, Flying Officer William Kenneth Manifold was sent on a dicing mission requested by the British Scientific Intelligence Officer Dr. R.V. Jones. His target was a mysterious German radar site near the French coast. Manifold's photographs were the first to clearly show the Freya early warning radar with its dish antenna and control equipment. Those images gave British scientists their first real look at how German radar worked, knowledge that led directly to new countermeasures and radar jamming systems. Manifold even broke protocol. After finishing his photo run, he dove back down and strafed the radar station, damaging it enough to knock it out temporarily. It was a reckless act, but one that captured the spirit of the reconnaissance pilots. They weren't supposed to fight, yet many couldn't resist taking a shot when the opportunity appeared. The most critical work focused on the port of Brest, where the German Navy's powerful warships Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper threatened the Atlantic shipping lanes. Pink Spitfires made repeated dicing missions over that deadly harbour. They photographed the ship's positions, the harbour's defences, and the bomb damage after RAF raids. They even captured the layout of anti-aircraft guns and camouflage nets, proving whether the enemy vessels were battle-ready or under repair. Those low-level, oblique photographs taken with side-mounted cameras showed details no bomber or high-altitude plane could capture. In December 1943, a series of photographs taken by PRU aircraft reached British intelligence. One of them changed the course of history. Photo interpreter Constance Babington-Smith studied an image of a German testing site at Peenemünde. There on the launch stand, she noticed a strange, wingless aircraft with a blunt nose. It was the V-1 flying bomb, the first of Germany's so-called vengeance weapons. Her discovery confirmed the reports of a secret rocket program and triggered Operation Crossbow, a massive Allied bombing campaign targeting the V-weapon factories and launch sites. Without those photos, the attacks on Britain by V-1 and V-2 rockets might have come without warning and with far greater effect. The PRU also played a key role in one of the most daring missions of the war, the Dambusters raid in May 1943. Before the attack, the Spitfires photographed every inch of the Murden Dam, documenting its structure, the water levels, and the German defences. After the raid, they returned to photograph the aftermath water pouring through the broken walls, entire valleys flooded below. Those pictures proved to the world that the impossible mission had succeeded. Their aircraft had flown more than 16,000 operational sorties, and their photographs had provided about 80% of all Allied intelligence gathered in Europe. Many pilots never returned, vanishing into the sea or the clouds, but the knowledge they brought back was priceless. One RAF officer summed it up best. "We sent the bombers where the PRU told us to go. Without them, we would have been bombing blind." It was a dangerous, mathematical kind of warfare, a cold equation of distance, light, and courage. And every time a pink Spitfire took off into the haze, it was a gamble between life and death, and a victory for the science of invisibility. From November 1940 to October 1942, when one PRU was disbanded and reorganized into 5 separate squadrons, NAM 540, 541, 542, 543, and 544. The unit lost approximately 50 aircraft and pilots on operations. That's roughly 1 loss per 320 sorties, a casualty rate of 0.31% per sortie. Compare this to Bomber Command's overall loss rate of approximately 3.8% per sortie during the same period. Reconnaissance pilots flew far fewer missions than bomber crews, but each mission penetrated deep into enemy territory without the protection of formation, flying, or defensive armament. The dicing missions, low-altitude reconnaissance flights over heavily defended targets, carried particularly high risk. These missions required pilots to fly predictable, steady courses at altitudes where anti-aircraft fire was most accurate, and fighter interception easiest to coordinate. The pink camouflage provided concealment, but not protection. If spotted, the unarmed reconnaissance Spitfire had only speed and maneuverability for defense. Several factors contributed to the PRU's survivability. Despite these challenges, first reconnaissance pilots were selected from the most experienced fighter pilots, then given extensive additional training in navigation, camera operation, and tactics for avoiding detection and escape. Second, missions were planned meticulously using the latest intelligence about German fighter dispositions, radar coverage, and anti-aircraft defenses. Third, aircraft were maintained to higher standards than typical fighter squadrons. Engine reliability was critical when flying 7-hour missions over enemy territory. The specialized camouflage schemes worked. While exact figures comparing pink versus blue aircraft losses don't exist in surviving records, anecdotal evidence from pilots' memoirs and after-action reports consistently describe pink aircraft completing missions during dawn and dusk hours with fewer interception attempts than aircraft in other camouflage schemes during similar time periods. The optical physics worked as designed. When used in the correct environmental conditions, pink made the aircraft extraordinarily difficult to detect. One metric stands out particularly during the period when Cotton's small flight of modified Spitfires operated from France. November 1939 to May 1940 covering approximately 5,000 square miles of enemy territory. Not a single aircraft was lost to enemy action. The flight evacuated ahead of German advances during the fall of France, with one aircraft damaged in an air raid at H-Stan Air Drome in September 1940. But operational losses during active reconnaissance missions was zero. This perfect record derived from Cotton's understanding that camouflage, speed, altitude, and timing formed an integrated system, not individual features. The Pink Spitfire succeeded because it rejected orthodox military thinking about camouflage in favor of optical physics. Standard camouflage theory assumed aircraft needed to match terrain when viewed from above or sky when viewed from below. This thinking optimized camouflage for specific viewing angles under specific conditions. The PRU approach recognized that reconnaissance aircraft operated under variable conditions, multiple altitudes, different times of day, changing weather, and viewing angles from multiple directions. No single camouflage pattern could optimize for all conditions. Instead, multiple specialized schemes were developed, each optimized for specific operational profiles. High-altitude work got PRU Blue. Low-altitude work in European maritime climate got PRU Pink. Low-altitude work in North African desert got Royal Blue. Each scheme matched its operational environment. This approach required understanding that human vision and the mechanical vision of cameras depends on contrast, not absolute color. An object becomes visible when it contrasts with its background. The pink paint didn't hide the Spitfire by making it blend with terrain or sky directly. It hid the Spitfire by matching the scattered light wavelengths present in atmospheric haze during low sun conditions. The aircraft disappeared not by looking like something else, but by looking like nothing, like empty atmosphere. The Royal Navy reached similar conclusions independently, painting destroyers and landing craft in Mountbatten pink, a brighter, more saturated pink than PRU Pink for Mediterranean operations. The long-range desert group used pink-painted trucks and Land Rovers in North Africa. In each case, the logic was identical. Pale pink matches the scattered light present in desert haze and early morning or evening atmospheric conditions better than any other color. Modern militaries still apply these principles. During the 1991 Gulf War, RAF Jaguar, Buccaneer, and Tornado GR, one aircraft were painted in a pink-tinted desert camouflage scheme that echoed the PRU approach. The color helped aircraft blend with desert heat haze and dust clouds kicked up by operations. Fighter pilots reported difficulty spotting friendly aircraft painted in the pink-tinted scheme, even at relatively close range during low-altitude operations. The fundamental lesson: effective camouflage requires understanding the specific conditions under which the object will be observed. No camouflage works everywhere. The Pink Spitfire worked brilliantly in its operational niche, medium altitude, dawn dust timing, maritime atmospheric conditions, and would have been disastrously visible in other conditions. From November 1940 to October 1942, the Photo Reconnaissance Unit went through major changes. Number 1 PRU was disbanded and reorganized into 5 new squadrons, numbers 540, 541, 542, 543, and 544. During that time, the unit lost around 50 aircraft and their pilots in action. That meant roughly 1 aircraft lost for every 320 missions, a casualty rate of about 0.3%. To compare, Bomber Command's average loss rate during the same period was almost 4% per mission. The difference sounds small on paper, but it meant life or death in the air. Reconnaissance pilots flew far fewer missions than bomber crews, but every one of their flights was deep into enemy territory and always alone. They had no squadron for protection, no gunners to return fire, and no armor to save them if they were hit. The most dangerous assignments were the dicing missions. These were the low-level flights over heavily defended ports and industrial sites. To get clear, sharp photos, the pilot had to fly steady and level a predictable path that made him an easy target for anti-aircraft guns. He couldn't dodge or climb until the cameras finished their run. The pink paint helped hide the aircraft, but it could never protect it. If a German fighter spotted them, the unarmed Spitfire's only defense was its speed, agility, and the nerve of its pilot. Even with these risks, the PRU's survival rate was remarkable. That success came from several key factors. First, only the best pilots were chosen. Reconnaissance pilots were handpicked from experienced fighter squadrons and then given extra training in navigation, camera operation, and tactics for avoiding interception or capture. Second, every mission was planned in precise detail. Routes were drawn using the latest intelligence on German radar positions, fighter patrols, and flak batteries. Even wind direction and cloud height were factored in. Third, their aircraft were maintained to the highest standard. Engine reliability was everything when you flew 7 hours over enemy territory with no radio and no guns. And the camouflage worked exactly as intended. Though there are no exact statistics comparing losses between PRU Blue and PRU Pink aircraft, pilots' diaries and after-action reports tell the same story. The Pink Spitfires, when flown during dawn or dusk, were intercepted far less often than those in other colours flying under similar conditions. The science behind it held true. In the right light, the pale pink tone made the aircraft extraordinarily hard to see. One statistic proves how effective the system was. From November 1939 to May 1940, when Sidney Cotton's small flight of modified Spitfires operated out of France, they covered more than 5,000 square miles of enemy territory, and not a single aircraft was lost to enemy action. They only suffered one damaged aircraft later that year, hit during a German air raid on their base at Heston Aerodrome in September 1940. But during active reconnaissance flights, their losses were zero. That perfect record came from Cotton's philosophy that speed, altitude, timing, and camouflage were not separate tools, but parts of one integrated system. The Pink Spitfire proved that idea perfectly. It worked because it defied traditional military thinking. Before Cotton, camouflage meant simply matching the terrain green for forests, blue for sky, brown for desert. That logic worked for bombers or ground vehicles viewed from one direction, but reconnaissance aircraft were seen from every direction, from below, above, and through layers of haze and cloud. No single pattern could hide them everywhere. The PRU's answer was specialization. Every color had a mission. PRU Blue for high-altitude flights above 30,000 feet, where the deep blue sky swallowed the aircraft. PRU Pink for low and medium-altitude missions in Europe, where the atmosphere was thick with maritime haze. And in North Africa, where the sunlight was sharper and the haze golden, a deeper royal blue replaced both. Each color was tuned for the exact environment and the time of day it was used. The science behind it came down to contrast, not color. Human vision, and even the black and white cameras used for spotting, detect edges and brightness before they notice hue. An object becomes visible only when it contrasts with its background. The pink paint didn't hide the Spitfire by making it look like the sky or the ground. It hid it by blending perfectly with the scattered light of dawn and dusk. It didn't look like something else. It looked like nothing like part of the air itself. The Royal Navy reached the same conclusion on the sea. They began painting ships and landing craft in Mountbatten Pink, a brighter, heavier version of PRU Pink, to blend with the haze of the Mediterranean. The long-range desert group followed the same logic, painting trucks and jeeps in pale pink to vanish into the heat haze of the Sahara. Decades later, the lesson still held true. During the 1991 Gulf War, the RAF painted their Jaguars, Buccaneers, and Tornado GR1s in a pink-tinted desert scheme modelled on the wartime PRU colours. The shade helped the aircraft merge with the dust and heat shimmer over the desert. Fighter pilots even reported that spotting another pink jet at low altitude was surprisingly difficult, even from short distances. The principle was simple, but timeless. No camouflage works everywhere. The secret is to understand when and where it must work and tailor it perfectly to those conditions. That was the genius of the Pink Spitfire. It wasn't the color itself that saved the pilots. It was the way the color, the altitude, the light, and the timing all came together, turning something that looked absurd on the ground into a weapon of invisibility in the sky. The mission profile.